Iranian poet, writer, and painter Nasrin Parwaz. Thank you very much for joining us today. I'll start with asking, how did you first become active against the Iranian regime and why?
First of all, thank you for having me. I became active in 1979 when the Islamic regime took power. Khomeini returned to Iran in February 1997 after 15 years in exile, and in March he said that women must wear a hijab. After his declaration, women poured out onto the street. The pictures of that day show rivers of women marching for their freedom of choice. When Khomeini saw these demonstrations, he backed off, though only for the time being. I wasn't in Iran at this time. I had come to the UK in 1978 to study, but I soon went back for the summer break. When I arrived, Tehran wasn't the same city I had left a year earlier. People had gained some freedom upon toppling the Shah, and the young were outspoken. The regime was trying to push people back to their homes. Many young people were trying to save the little freedom they had found in the vacuum between the two powers and had become active against the regime. There was a collective struggle against the regime's brutality, and there was a sense of humanity I had not seen before. People cared for each other. For example, when we had a demonstration for our rights and the Islamic guards attacked us, we used to run away and the guards would follow us. People would open their doors to us to save us, even though that meant they would face harassment from the guards. About 6 months after the regime took power, they attacked Kurdistan and massacred some villages. They massacred everyone they found in Garna and Galatan. In Garna, 68 people were killed in 3 hours.
So sad, so sad. As far as I understand, at the time of Islamic revolution, there were extreme human rights violations, torture, and ill treatment, especially towards the political activists. I want to ask, as a young woman, you could escape back to UK for a better future. Why you didn't leave that awful situation, and what made you to stay to fight?
First of all, I have to say that it wasn't an Islamic revolution. The people's uprising was led by the Islamists and the West to this end. The WikiLeaks documents show that America had secret meetings with Khomeini both when he was still in France and when he went to Iran. They helped him to lead the revolution to an Islamic regime. In their public affairs, Western governments presented themselves as behind the Shah or his prime minister. But in fact, they were plotting for Khomeini's rise to power. Before the Shah left the country, the top members of the army were consulted about Khomeini's candidate for prime minister, and America's ambassador reported to Washington that the top army officials had no problem with Khomeini's candidate for prime minister. People didn't know who Khomeini was.
Mm-hmm.
The West brought him to France and made a leader of him by interviewing him about Iran's future. And why I stayed? I went to Iran for the 1979 summer break, but very soon I became involved with politics. There were lots of political meetings in universities which were new to me, and I attended them. We didn't have such freedom when the Shah was in power. In fact, a scene there changed the course of my life. One day I encountered a sea of people on Revolution Road and asked them what the demonstration was about. They said that the regime had banned a newspaper and people knew that if the regime couldn't stand that newspaper, then it wouldn't stand any free press. That's why they had poured out. Crowds are known to have an effect on people, and this one deeply affected me. I was happy to see all those people coming out in defense of the freedom of press. I walked with them trying to see the uh, front and the end of the demonstration, but it was impossible. Hundreds of thousands of people were there. We were walking and chanting slogans in defense of freedom of expression when some men attacked us by throwing stones into the crowd. I hid behind the drawing board I had with me. It saved me, but it was broken. Soon, people's faces or parts of their bodies were knifed in front of me. I was shocked. I had never seen such a thing. At the same time, I felt a kind of anger that I had never experienced. It was against the regime that was trying to take away the freedom that people had found upon toppling the Shah. There was, um, there are reasons that, these are reasons that I too became active against the regime and struggle for freedom, for my freedom, the freedom entitled to all peoples. We were all trying to make change for a better society. If we weren't successful, it doesn't mean we were wrong or we should have abandoned our struggle and escaped the scene.
Okay. Nesrin, I've read some of your interviews, and in one of your interviews, you mentioned about Iranian women's struggle against sexual apartheid started in 1979. Did men supported the women's struggle enough after Khomeini arrived in Iran?
No, unfortunately, men didn't support the women's struggle against the sexual apartheid in Iran. If you look at the pictures of the demonstrations on 8th March 1979 against Khomeini's decree that women should wear hijab, you rarely see men. And if you see them, they are standing watching women marching for their freedom of choice. Yes, pictures talk. Unfortunately, during the last 40 years, because of Islamic law that states male relatives are in charge of their female relatives, the killing of women by their male relatives has increased. I must say, men even benefited from this gender apartheid. You may wonder how. Since all the laws are against women and give men the upper hand or put women's fate in the hands of their male relatives, men have become in charge of women's lives. For example, the law states that boys inherit twice that of girls, and despite this, men could say no to this law and have equal inheritance with their sisters. Instead, they accepted and just enjoy the doubled money. This has created a bitterness in some families as women can't stand such attitudes from their brothers.
Okay. So within these situations, as a young woman, you detained at the age of 23 and first put into Evin prison, which is also very well known by us Kurds. And you were sentenced to death penalty and then spent 8 years in prison. If it is okay to ask, who did interrogate you? Where were you interrogated? In what circumstances? Was a joint committee interrogation center where political prisoners were being tortured? Was it in use? Or was it a museum at that time you detained?
I was interrogated by the Islamic guards in the Joint Committee Interrogation Center, which was in the hands of the Islamic Guards Corps. By then, it wasn't a museum yet. They turned it into a museum in 2003. They used that interrogation center for more than 20 years. Yet, when they turned it into a museum, they said it was only used by the Shah's regime. I was first taken there and I was kept there for 6 months. Prisoners died under torture there. I was flogged until I was paralyzed.
So sorry to hear that. You and the other women in prison faced awful ill treatment, systematical tortures, oppression as political, of course, female political prisoners in prison in Iran. What made you and the others, other women, to keep your spirit, to keep your strength and friendship, to resist as Iranian women in prisons?
Hundreds of thousands of people were arrested and thousands were executed. Prisoners were tortured to do confessions in public in front of other prisoners or even on TV before their execution. All these made us so angry that we used our power to say no to the regime's demands.
Okay, okay. As far as I know, it's forbidden to take photos outside and inside around Evin prison, which has been a home to political prisoners. As an artist, you have powerful paintings of Evin prison, where you suffered a lot, actually. What is the message through your art, through your paintings?
I would like to show things to people that they don't know about themselves. They, their minds and eyes are trained not to see them. Prison paintings is one of my themes because despite the fact that hundreds of thousands were arrested, still people don't know how it looked like or what it felt like to be there.
Yes, yeah. And spending 8 years in prison, you were released in 1990. I understand horrible conditions have been experienced in prison, but they couldn't break your spirit to fight against injustices. How did you overcome the trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder you had experienced?
Only a year after I came here, that being 4 years after my release, I started having nightmares about prison. I called freedom from torture and started having therapy. But I don't think that only therapy helped me to overcome my prison experience. The struggle against the regime and against all injustice helped me a lot. I think the remedy against the oppression of capitalism is to struggle against it.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't stop. Uh, After being released, after you have experienced all those trauma and etc., you've been actually quite active and continued your struggle against execution, torture, and equal rights. Could you please tell us what happened after you were released and your involvement in activities against injustices in Iran and the world as a woman, poet, writer, and painter? Uh, for instance, one of your short stories, A War Against Womanhood, won the Women's World Award in 2003, I think.
When I was released, I found the social situation worse than before. Poverty was more widespread and greater than when I was arrested. So again, I became involved in the struggle against the regime until the time I had to escape. So 3 years after my release, I came here and claimed for asylum. And here too, I continued my struggle against the regime. Still, prisoners are tortured to condemn their views and their activities and forced to accept criminal activities that they've never done. These confessions are broadcast on TV and are also used to condemn someone who was arrested in a peaceful demonstration to execution. There were some uprisings between 2017 to 2019, and thousands of people were arrested. Then they were tortured to confess to murder, and those confessions were used to condemn them to execution. At the moment, I'm trying to save the lives of 11 young men who were arrested in a peaceful demonstration and were condemned to execution. They are workers who were struggling with their life expenses and joined the demonstration to protest these. Navid Afkari was on my list. He was a wrestler and was executed last month. He too was a worker and couldn't pursue his interest in wrestling. In fact, he was born a worker as he was a child worker. He went to Azadi Park to sell chewing gum and kites before he was 7 years old. I hope those who listen to this interview sign and share my petition and we can save these men's lives. Yes, my writing is also about injustice, but in forms of stories or poems.
You also wrote two books. One of them is about your memoirs in prison, which is called One Woman's Struggle in Iran. It was published in Farsi in 2002, and the English version was published in 2018. Could you please tell us about your book? What is it about?
Um, it's about my time in prison and the 8 years journey I had. My first 6 months in the Joint Committee Interrogation Center, then Evin Prison, Kazaleza Prison, and Guardash Prison. I was with different women in each of these prisons and I witnessed both different and similar tortures. It's about women's friendship, their support for each other, and our struggle, even in prison. Of course, it's also a snapshot to the regime's cruelty during the 80s, when so many people were executed.
Yeah. And you have another book, The Secret Letters from X to A. What is it about?
The Secret Letters from X to A is a historical novel. Its setting is the Joint Committee Interrogation Center and how the regime turned it into a museum after 20 years of using it. It's based on true story of a building that was designed by Nazi architects and was finished and ready to use in 1937. It's a love story at the same time, and the characters are also based on people I knew. For example, the main female character is based on a woman I met in prison who said no to the regime.
Mhm, mhm. My next question will be about Iranian women. How is the situation of resistance of Iranian women now? And what do you think about the role of women in Iran in the future?
At the moment, women are active against the regime and they are unstoppable. There are many women in prison who are condemned to long sentences. Some of them were arrested for removing their scarves in public. Perhaps you've seen the pictures of them standing on a platform waving their scarves. And the role of women in future of Iran, well, I think women would not stand anything that doesn't recognize their rights fully. I think they would decide for themselves and they would try to make sure that the future law changes for gender equality as well as all equal rights for everyone.
Mhm, mhm. Um, I'm asking my last question as a Kurdish woman. Where did you get all this strength? Was it always in your spirit to fight against injustice?
There are so many people who are struggling against injustice, and I'm one of them. Each of us deserve a better life. We deserve freedom, and we have to fight for it.
Thank you very much, Nasrin. It was a pleasure
Yeah,
for me to talk to you.
you're welcome.
Thank you.